The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be back with you again today at the Bear Psychology Radio Show. We have a guest again, Blair Sorrel, who has written a Schizoid at Smith, and Blair's going to talk a little bit about her book. I'm sorry, we are logging on a little bit later than usual. Technical difficulties, and we've all been there for sure. Remember that if you have questions or comments or anything you want to say to us, in studio101@gmail.com. We love to hear from you during the show. And this is particularly interesting because we're going to get a chance to talk to Blair about her insights about schizoid personality disorder, which is really, really rare in women, much more frequently diagnosed in males. But in general, it is anyways a very, very overlooked personality disorder. So we're going to get a little bit of insight into that from Blair's perspective, and also understand a little bit about her life experiences, how she got to writing a memoir, growing up in the 60s and 70s, what made sense to her, and having a diagnosis at 33, how that was life transforming. And I want to welcome you, Blair. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you on board. I know that you're a writer, and you've made a really big splash with this book, a Schizoid at Smith. That it's a memoir, really your own story of alienation, kind of being very reflective, looking at your own life, telling your own stories, and what really looks like to me a greater sense of self-acceptance that came after many, many years. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what brought you to writing this book after kind of a lifetime of living with schizoid personality disorder.
What brought me to writing the book was recognition that this condition accounts for high levels of homelessness. And I knew that directly from my clinician back in the 80s. And that was reinforced if you look in Wikipedia under schizoid personality. 65% of a New York City drop-in center were homeless schizoids. And I think that those individuals presented out of desperation. The weather must have been bitterly cold. for it to be untenable for them to remain outdoors or at their distance. And that's what they're inured to do. That's why this condition doesn't present clinically, because the symptoms preclude it. And
So do
I
you think,
recognize that.
sorry,
I'm
Blair,
sorry.
do you think, no, do you think that a large number of people in the homeless drop-in centers um, have either a mental health condition, or are you saying specifically schizoid personality disorder?
It said, it says in Wikipedia, schizoid personality disorder. They were assessed.
Sorry,
And
so,
I am willing to wager far more are outside, not in that drop-in center, because they resist contact.
right, okay. Well, I do agree with you that there's a large number of people who are homeless who have significant mental health struggles, whether that is from uh, exposure to trauma or schizophrenia or another mental health disorder. And it sounds like one of the things you became aware of is that homeless insecurity is a pretty profound issue in these shelters. Have you spent some time in the shelters?
No, I haven't whatsoever. I'm a doctor's child who went to Smith. But we
Right.
have to wonder what happened, what caused me to underachieve. So I did my own analysis of my formative years
Hmm.
and how my upbringing contributed to forcing me into withdrawal and living more in fantasy and having marginal contact with the world around me.
Hmm.
I recognize the symptomology, the difficulty focusing, chronic tardiness, aversion to social gatherings, relationships, dating, the whole 9 yards. And
Hmm.
I felt that the worst thing that had happened to me could be the best thing for clinicians and for people who are struggling with this, so that they don't wind up homeless, dead, dependent on their families lifelong. The parents don't become lifelong benefactors.
Hmm.
That this was a serious problem. It caused me a great deal of hardship.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
I want to be clear that schizoids are not necessarily impaired. It depends upon their level of anxiety about
Mhm.
dealing with people. And for those who are severely anxious, they will not be able to concentrate in the presence of other people. So they're going to have problems at school and then later at work, which is why they eventually give up and become homeless. That's
I
the
mean,
worst case scenario.
it it is quite a significant disorder to be diagnosed with, and we do see that it is from the DSM, it's a pervasive pattern of detachment from social relationships and a very restricted range of emotional expression. And certainly, as you are explaining, there's a real kind of tendency for social withdrawal, very few or no close friendships, detachment, flattened affect, indifference to praise or criticism, but from looking at your book and kind of getting a sense of what you've accomplished, it sounds like you have actually figured out some ways to navigate this, to figure out how to thrive. Can you tell us a little bit of the story about how you started to write? Because it sounds like the writing has been a really good avenue for you.
Well, Teilhard de Chardin, the theologian and philosopher, said that the trick in life is to take anything bad and turn it into something good. So I
Yes.
did this strictly as public service, knowing that my story would be instructive, that I could try to reach not only the afflicted, but parents, with the hope of preventing it and prevailing on guardians to take a more balanced approach. Because the only defense a child has from verbal abuse is not to listen, and that will carry over. Again, not every schizoid is impaired. The actual writing, the pandemic was the worst thing. That was the best thing for a writing project for me because, I was used to social distancing and hunkering down. And the dynamics were ideal for me to do this. I had said I would do it. I was very hell-bent on using my writing to crack open how SPD happens for the reason. And with, my intentions were good. It's not a vilification of parents, but I wasn't going to sugarcoat. So
Yeah.
I started writing during the pandemic. Harry Friedman, the author, was my writing coach. I wrote a chapter a month, and the rest is history.
And I mean, what was that like for you to write about your story? Did you find that to be therapeutic on a personal level?
It was not as cathartic as people have suggested it would be. It was fulfilling because I felt I understood the importance of what I was doing. So little was known about this condition.
And particularly for women.
Particularly for women, but I hypothesized that a mother is more likely to bond with a female child. And that may be the reason why SPD occurs more rampantly among men. But whatever the reason, it is underreported. So we don't know how many schizoids are out there who are not seeking treatment, who think it's going to get better, whose lives are self-destructive and probably short-lived because there are ramifications. It's a dangerous condition to live with. Imagine going through your life not seeking a doctor, not going for any kind of expert guidance, financial, legal, and how self-victimizing that is. In addition to not being able to work, you could end up, the only other schizoid I know firsthand had an MBA and lived at home lifelong until he could no longer afford to live at home because he didn't know how to manage. He never learned to budget, and he was too fearful of seeking a financial planner, so he plummeted into destitution and is now in a homeless shelter. That's somebody with an MBA.
Right. And I mean, it really has nothing to do with intellectual capacity. That's absolutely clear to me that these are two separate issues, that you can be very psychologically, very intellectually adept, but still struggle with these issues related to schizoid personality disorder. Your parents, you referenced your father was a doctor. Your father was an ophthalmologist with a practice in New York, and your mother was with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps nurse during World War II. I wonder what happened to your parents, and if what happened to your parents in their lifetime impacted you in the development of schizoid personality disorder, or maybe their inability to parent you in a way that would have been beneficial for you, whether you had SPD or not.
Well, we have to wrench our minds to the greatest generation. If somebody was different or weak or couldn't manage, that would have been seen as a character deficiency, not a character disorder. There's much greater transparency nowadays about any kind of personality disorder, character disorder, SPD, which is a maladaptation. I lived a little over a mile away from McLean Hospital. We never went there. My mother started doing my homework. My mother had very, very high expectations. And I think because I resembled her, she wanted an improved version of herself. Well-intentioned though it may be, it was disastrous for me. And when I wasn't doing my homework, it would have been more appropriate to seek psychiatric intervention. They didn't do that. My father was very detached from the situation. I think both parents were in situations as a couple that they really didn't want to be in. My father wanted companionship, but he really didn't want the involvement in family or children. My mother wanted a career. Her grandmother had told her to become a doctor, not a nurse. So, they were at each other's throats. I was more bonded to my mother because she was a more vulnerable individual.
Right. Okay. It sounds like somehow your parents, they were struggling themselves. It doesn't sound like either of them were really enjoying the experience of their life. And I was just wondering, because of what your mother might have experienced during World War II, what did she have a diagnosis of PTSD? Was your father also SPD?
If they were, they wouldn't have sought intervention. They didn't seek it for me, and I think they would have been in gross denial because that's the mindset of people. It's a bootstrapper mentality that and you can't pull yourself up by the bootstraps if you have emotional problems, if you don't have those bootstraps.
Yeah.
I think my father would have been happy. Nowadays, there are single, never married men, what the British call old fogey bachelors, and he would have been better off that way. My mother would have had a career. But social options and acceptance are much greater nowadays. My father needed to marry as a doctor because it confers respectability. In that generation, if you weren't married, an older male, there would have been the veiled suspicion of homosexuality. And maybe their parents goaded on them. It was, after all, a baby boom. Maybe they didn't really want babies. And I say, if you don't really want kids or family for the sake of those kids, absent. You can't handle your child, find intervention. It's made affordable to everyone.
So are you saying, Blair, that you believe that you would not have developed schizoid personality disorder if you had different parents?
Without a doubt, absolutely positively that this is preventable. It's a maladaptation. No baby is born with a defense. There's no reason for a child to stop listening unless whatever they're subjected to is unbearable. They simply can't listen to it. And so what they're going to do is tune out. I learned it by the time I was 5 years old.
Okay, that's very heart-wrenching, I have to say.
What?
What were you going to say?
No. I mean, I do read stuff on the internet that, it's inborn in this, it's environmental. I even noticed improvement in myself when I was among more normative families that were affectionate, that clearly loved their own children, treated me like one of their own. I wasn't distracted. I was punctual. My self-esteem was better. My focus, all of it, even in those circumstances, because if you don't love a child, if the kid never feels loved, it will taint absolutely everything. That's just looking at the emotional impact of this. Also, let's consider the financial impact. You, a parent, do you want to be supporting this kid 50 years later? Do you want children who never leave home, who don't date, who don't have friends, who are doing gig work or something? They may not even be able to hold a menial job, because all of those jobs, no matter how lowly or skilled, require punctuality and focus. Social skills is also another aspect of it, and they weigh very heavily in corporate America. They're more important, actually, than job skills, which can be taught. Social skills can't. So I want people to think about the consequences, not for just for the anguish of their own children, but what the anguish could be for a parent. As you age, do you want to worry that your kid, might become homeless or something like that?
Right, for sure. These are really big issues, and yet, it's really reminding me, Blair, of two authors that I have previously interviewed. One is Children of Emotionally Immature Parents.
Right.
Um, and I don't know if you're familiar with this work, the Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, and what the parents lack then shapes the child. And eventually we see certain signs, not necessarily diagnosis, but certain things that people struggle with chronically, like difficulty with boundaries, need for validation, people pleasing, low self-worth, emotional regulation issues, fear of abandonment, relationship difficulties, feeling like you have to be the grown-up somehow, and inability to easily express your emotions, or maybe you have shut down emotions, in some cases perfectionism. When you're talking about your parents, it sounds like the parenting created a kind of response sequence within inside of yourself to protect yourself from that environment. Does that sound about right?
Yes, it does. It's what a clinician would call being forced into withdrawal, or kind of fantasy state, because that's the only defense I had and the only way I could survive it. But again, not every schizoid is impaired, and I can't tell you why that is. There are schizoids who can just sit in the corner. But for those who are impaired, especially with the level of anxiety that I had, they're not going to be able to manage. Like this guy with the MBA who's presently in a homeless shelter. But Adult Protective Services has to be his guardian, had to move him out of his parents' home.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, it's almost tragic. And you would think that that's a scenario that I concocted because it's so extreme. There are schizoids who can function all right. It depends upon the kind of job, if it's relatively isolated. There's now remote work, which I think is a better option. But a clinician would also say that man is meant to be social and that there's more potential for happiness than living this marginalized life.
Right, if you can tolerate it. And it sounds like there was so much social discomfort that withdrawal works better than contact, at least for you. And I am wondering, because it sounds like you look at how you were shaped growing up in your family of origin, and you tell some stories about what that was like, but you also tell stories about kind of being in your community and teasing, and how it spilled over from your home life into the life of the world around you. But you actually managed to get to university, and I'm wondering, what was that like for you?
Well, again, I felt I was different. I wasn't quite like the other Smiths, who were polished, who were confident, poised. I knew that I was intellectually, but I still had extreme self-doubt. If anything went well, it was a fluke. I had enormous difficulty developing any kind of confidence. Those negative nagging voices just unfortunately haunted me lifelong.
Mm-hmm. And that inner kind of inner agony, does that still stay with you today, Blair, or have you found ways to manage that inner state?
Well, I try to focus more on positive things, like that I'm helping other people, I'm helping their parents and their children, that I'm not vilifying my own parents. They were just poor parents. None of this was done maliciously. It was inept. but there are consequences, and they're serious if it continues to be done. And they're a societal toll. Look at the levels of homelessness, which is a complex issue. But to the extent that SBT contributes, I'd like to break the cycle, and that's what I'm trying to do. It's more recessed because I'm older, and, I've been able to find fulfillment. I volunteered a lot. That made me comfortable with people. I was always good superficially, actually, dealing with others. The problems, of course, was that if I continually ran late, and I wasn't all there, that would be, meet with a negative response. But over the years, I became less afraid and better able to deal with situations. So it is manageable, but I don't know that it's manageable if you never seek treatment. That's
right. And you did seek treatment. So maybe, would you mind telling me a little bit about that? And then I'd also like to hear about the kind of volunteering that you did as well. So maybe you can start by helping me to understand how the treatment might have made a difference for you.
Well, I was trying to become an advertising copywriter. And I was working on a book far longer than anybody ever works on a book. And I never wanted to show it to anybody. So it was a way of filling time and avoiding contact. Then there were some situations within my apartment building and friendships, and everything seemed to backfire. I just felt totally like a ship that was rudderless, that was just sinking. And I wasn't desperate, but I felt that something had to change, and I wasn't really capable of changing it on my own. I had the misguided belief that things would get better surreptitiously, and they didn't. They kept getting more so, if not worse. So I was in crisis. I was traumatized. There's only so much, in the way of dismissals and firings that the Constitution could bear. And so I was going here and there trying to get into treatment. And I went to a private practitioner who knew right away that I suffered from withdrawal from the way that I spoke. She did testing, most of which showed that I was in fantasy. All the jobs, of course. And she said it could take a number of years for us to, it was a relief and a disappointment because we all want quick fixes. But it was going to take some time.
So
in the meantime,
I'm sorry. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding something, Blair. The clinician immediately recognized that you were relying on fantasy. Were you relying on fantasy to survive, Blair?
I think it's just a conditioned modus operandi I had from the time this was imprinted when I was 5 years old. That the difference between me and most other people that I interacted was that I was more in fantasy. That people would say to me that I didn't read the cues, that I was not all there, that I was out of touch, that I was delusional in a lot of ways. I have the ability, of course, to know reality from fantasy, but it was just a way of filling time, a kind of a social life aside from music for me that I preferred, which was probably a safe refuge.
Your music was a safe refuge.
Absolutely. It was a lifeline.
When do you think you first realized? I know you were diagnosed at 33. I've got an email from Cindy. Thank you for writing in, Cindy, who's saying that she just tuned in and she's assuming that she's wondering how old you were when you found out that this was happening to you. And I'm actually wondering, how old were you when you first started to recognize something wasn't really the same for you as others?
In childhood,
Mm-hmm.
I was bullied, ostracized, treated as wacky. My high school class voted me most unique, and I don't think they meant it as a compliment.
Okay.
So lifelong. I mean, as I said before, this started at 5 years old. I had teachers who would ask me what was wrong. Maybe they thought I was stoned because, after all, this was the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Mm-hmm.
And since they don't really know, other people tend to strike at something they don't understand.
For sure, for sure.
Um,
Now, I've got another email. This one is from Grant, and Grant says, "Wow, this is so interesting. So, how is schizoid personality disorder preventable? Is it?" And Grant is writing in from Los Angeles. Thank you so much, Grant. What do you think? Do you think it would have been preventable? Would there have been
I
anything that could
absolutely,
have happened?
my parents, my mother in particular, who was very domineering, had taken a more balanced approach. Neurotypical or more normal people see equal parts rejection and acceptance. Schizoids do not. They see interacting with other people as detrimental, ultimately harmful, and that other people are best avoided. So if my parents, and my mother in particular, had been accepting and rejecting, had been critical in a less vituperative fashion,
Mhm.
and not in this castrating way, I would have been a much better adjusted child. And as I said before, if she could not handle me after this became imprinted, it would have been better to seek outside guidance, but that's a different era, an era where transparency didn't really exist and there's too much stigma. For vainglorious parents, saying that you have a troubled child is an admission that they failed.
So you not doing well because of their treatment was a failure on them that they wanted to hide by the sounds
Absolutely.
of it.
Even, throughout, when I asked my father if I could go for help when I was in my 20s, and he was very dismissive. Oh, I think the whole thing is a lack of confidence. Lack of
Mm-hmm.
confidence is a symptom of it, but certainly not the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So even into adulthood, he was suppressing. It would have made more sense then. What ultimately happened, because he was a doctor, is that he ended up supporting me. I could not work. He used his Social Security check to pay the rent of my rent-stabilized apartment, which was very nominal. And I went off and volunteered.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. So, I really think the work of Johnny's Webb fits really well with what you're describing. And, she's written a couple of books. One is Running on Empty, Overcome Your Childhood Emotional Neglect, and Running on
Yeah.
Empty No More. And she has this really great childhood emotional neglect questionnaire in which you can kind of identify the kind of core elements of being emotionally neglected as a child. And I think, you describe your mother as being particularly neglectful and not really able to show up for you in a meaningful way. Were there any figures in your life growing up that you felt kind of gave you a little bit more of that warmth and connection that helped you a bit?
When I went to my classmates' homes, I was invited for holidays, and they doted on me the way they doted on their own children, as I said before. I did not have a mentor, if you're asking me. And I really had no one in my family situation. It's like Jim Morrison. I rose from the position of being a lonely, alienated person. His father didn't get him either.
Mm-hmm.
And he had everything but the emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why in the book, There's identification with rock icons as being vulnerable individuals, not their stage performances or, what's written in teen magazines, but John Lennon's mediocre report cards. He was thought to be dyslexic, although never formally said, but clearly nobody would question John Lennon's intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
When you're always a little punch drunk, as I was with this condition, I was made to feel stupid. So then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then you have reason to question your abilities, no matter how gifted. You could be a genius, but you may not be able to. I would say you would likely not be able to work with this disorder if you're anxious. If you're not impaired, fine for you. But that's why Selma, my clinician, the New York State Office of Disability told me I was better off out of an office with this disorder and to get help with concentration.
So sorry, they told you you're better off not, I'm a little confused about what you mean by that. You're better off getting help
out of an office.
What does that mean, out of an office?
I went to the New York State Office of Disability,
Mm-hmm.
and the staffer who was familiar with the disorder
Mm-hmm.
said to me, you are better off out of an office or not working in an office.
Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, I see. Okay,
and
so
to
yeah.
get help with concentration.
Okay, so what they were saying is they were giving you a recommendation to, if you were going to get a job somewhere, office work would not be a good fit for you.
Well, remote work didn't exist back then.
No, it did not. No, it did not.
She suggested writing because I could write, but remember that it would be more challenging for me to make deadlines and collect payment than for a more normal individual. Anything that's going to put me in closer contact with other people is more daunting. So often freelance writing became free. I was not confrontational. I was not going to show up and bang on the door for my check. So that really wasn't viable. Besides which, the reality is that freelance, even if you're more normal, often becomes free. And that's a hard scrabble life. So I was really I was really in a nowhere situation. And that's putting it as diplomatically as possible. I couldn't work.
Yeah. It's kind of a shocking reality that the parenting, and I'm going to go back to childhood emotional neglect or abuse, that it shapes a person so profoundly as to kind of steal your future. And, as you describe it, it sounds like with different parents, you would have lived a different life. For example, when you went to visit your friends in their home and you had that very, very different experience, it gave you a window into how you could feel inside of yourself. It's a really kind of shocking reality that home environment so much. This is from Larry, who's writing in, and he asks if medication helps with any of this. Can you answer that question for us, Blair?
Yes, I went through a number of drug studies. Medication for anxiety and depression will definitely help. There isn't a medication for SPD, but what happens is that, as with my own case, I was severely anxious and depressed, so I went for treatment for those and then was diagnosed for SPD. It's usually with a comorbidity that this is discovered because the condition is so little understood and so unlikely to present.
Mm-hmm.
One clinician said about schizoids, he said, well, I never see them.
Right, because they're not coming to the office for treatment.
Right. Well, people who are blocked from intimacy are extremely unlikely to go to a therapist, go for a preventative screening, visit a doctor, a dentist. As the person that I described with the MBA, his whole situation was completely salvageable had he sought intervention. But because of his anxiety and his blockage from intimacy, he self-victimized.
Mm-hmm.
He had an MBA, worked for years in a federal job, so he had a pension. He had Social Security. He had an inheritance. You wonder why, living lifelong at home and never paying rent, he didn't save anything. He didn't know how to budget. He had a lot of financial boons. So what happened? What happened to me graduating from Smith in good standing, that I was near homelessness, that I had to depend upon my father lifelong? There are serious ramifications to this.
Yeah, and it also sounds like, you can fall through the cracks and not get the care and the guidance that's needed. And obviously people can take advantage, if that's what they're inclined to do. There's a vulnerability from what it sounds like to me, for somebody with SPD, that you can be taken advantage of because you don't have those inherent skills and you are not seeking assistance in ways that will work. Does that sound right?
You are so spot on about that. People will take advantage of you. You will be bullied as a child in all likelihood. You could self-victimize in many situations because you're afraid to say no. You don't read the cues. You are totally vulnerable. I know that Eleanor Greenberg thinks that NYC is an ideal place for Zoids because they can fall between the cracks. And I say, if they're not impaired and that's what they want to do, and be the reclusive person in the apartment building nobody really knows, doesn't have any girlfriends or family visiting, fine. I think it's a disastrous choice for anybody who's impaired. I can't tell you how many times I was pickpocketed and mugged in that city. And that can happen anywhere, but let's be there. If you're going around in a stupor,
Mm-hmm.
in a place that is predatory, that's not a good kid.
Well,
So I disagree with that.
That sounds very frightening, because not only are you struggling with an internal world of heightened anxiety, but then you are actually in real danger, because the mechanism of survival, it doesn't kind of give you that sense of how to survive in a social situation, that people can um, uh, kind of intrude on your space and take advantage in ways that are unexpected. I mean, it sounds like it is not an easy way to survive. How are you navigating that today? Are you in a place that feels safer and more settled for you? What strategies are you using today, Blair?
Well, I left New York a decade ago. I live in a small town, Lawrence, in northern Massachusetts, that has wonderful social service, high levels of homelessness, but it's a caring community. The city takes very good care of its residents. And so I don't have the same kind of stressors, but going about in a fog in one's own little world, let's remember the cars are a lot bigger, and pedestrian casualties as of last year were at a 40-year high because of these vehicles. So I stay on the sidewalk as much as possible. I wear eyeglass chains. I buy bright colored silicone watches so I can find them. I make a habit of leaving whatever I need in the same places, so I have sort of a repetition and security in that, because you're fogged out so much. There are times when I've had my glasses on my head and I wasn't even aware that where they were.
Okay,
I mean,
but
it
I'm
sounds
sorry,
like
but Blair, that's happened to me too.
I know it sounds like, just senility. And if it were only just early senility, I would say great. Most of the time, a clinician said to me, well, you saw what it's like to live with, meaning SPD. I did. Now make that a merciful bullet in the back of my head in my sleep. This is a life I would not wish on anyone. And that, my friend, is why I wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You wrote about Selma Landsberg. I wonder what your
Right.
experience was like with her.
It was very good. She was elderly when I saw her. As I said, she knew right away that I suffered from withdrawal. She
Did
did
she
testing.
diagnose you? Was she the one who
Yes, she did.
diagnosed? She
Yeah,
did.
she was in private practice. And I think I found her through William Allenson White. I was completely traumatized. She did testing and she said that, I had no reason to feel inferior, at least from an intellectual standpoint.
Right.
And you don't, but it's like the split that you can be very strong intellectually and weak emotionally. Look at Franz Kafka. He's presumed to be a schizoid. He wrote to his father in a 45-page treatise that he was, quote, mentally incapable of marriage. Or Emily Dickinson, who's also thought to be Zoid. In her day, you didn't have to go into an office. You didn't even have to leave home.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a different world if, like myself, you found yourself single, trying to survive, forget about thriving, and you're impaired. I mean, there were times that I was almost hit by cars or buses because I was so fogged out.
Are you less fogged out today than you were in the past?
Yes, I'm a much more alert, but I'm less afraid. And being less afraid, the symptoms will subside. Going into those households that were nurturing, I had an immediate sense of that, being almost a different person.
So it sounds like the therapy was incredibly beneficial.
It was, but also I think the volunteering, being around people, doing rescue work, having cats, being less focused on myself. I felt since SPD is the hallmark of SPD is excessive self-absorption, selflessness really contributed a lot. And I would go into situations where not only the other volunteers or the staffers were kind, but I saw that people had real problems that were more existential, especially if they were physically challenged, that their hand was worse than mine in a lot of ways. And so it gave me more perspective and made me less self-oriented. And that I could see that, people could be kind, they could be cruel, but they weren't overwhelmingly cruel either. And that's the key to overcoming this, is developing whole object relations that you can see have a more integrated and accepting view of other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it really sounds like your experience of schizoid personality disorder is a range. It's not like, do you have it or do you not have it, but where are you on the spectrum of this range? Where do you think you are if the range was 100%? Where do you think you are on that range of functioning?
I'd say 75%. I still have these Zoid problems, forgetfulness, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And the holidays are approaching and I'd rather not go. I still have that. If I'm in a social setting, I tend to keep to myself, but I don't feel as fearful of interacting with people. I was never, Selma said that I wasn't very typical of schizoids, and I don't know. There are so many different kinds of people. I know what she was thinking. I wrote about Henry Darger, the janitor, whose artwork was discovered by his landlord. He might have been very much more typical, or the man that I told you, the MBA, who didn't have any friends, who couldn't make eye contact, who lived at home lifelong, whose speech was incoherent. Those may be perceived as more typical of schizoids. It's like anything else, any other diagnosis, things affect people differently. He may never have left home, but because he had a federal job, he had more job security than I had, for example.
Right, I see that.
So,
No, that was definitely an asset, but it sounds like, so to me, it sounds like there's two things that are standing out. One is you seem to be very well versed, well read about others who had or are suspected of having had schizoid personality disorder. So, reading about those people, how has that helped you?
well, I'm not alone, even though I'm a loner.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure I would even want to meet them. I feel it's great that they got the recognition for their talents, although usually it was posthumous. They lived in a different era, the two that I've mentioned. I find it kind of a sad life because there are enough studies that indicate the social interaction. Even just having a daily conversation will prolong one's life.
Mm-hmm.
As I've gotten older, no man is an island. I can't totally self-isolate, and that's why we call it assisted living. There are realities to this, that as much as they may want to sequester themselves, it is extremely risky, if not dangerous, not to do the nominal. You don't have to be close to the people in the office. You don't have to schmooze. You can have a level of involvement that isn't that uncomfortable or disagreeable.
Okay. I want to end just having a brief conversation about the role of music in your healing and well-being overall. And then we will wrap up and say goodbye to our listeners today. Maybe you can just tell me a little bit about how music has helped you.
Well, it soothes the savage beast, as the cliche goes. The music in the book are emotional proxies. The songs articulate what I couldn't, the kind of emotions that I couldn't express. The rock stars I've already touched on, their avatars, but it was a lifeline for me because I could find a place where I was understood and create the harmonies of my life. I knew it, I loved it. It made me feel at peace, even though a lot of it was pulsating. And it has been indicated that there's a kind of musicality in the prose of the book, excuse me, which I'm
It
not
is
even
lyrical,
conscious of.
that's for sure. Yeah, it's very lyrical, I have to say. I want to tell people that a schizoid at Smith, how overparenting leads to underachieving. The link is in our blog post, and it is available on Amazon. Blair, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story, your insights, and really your courage to help us understand schizoid personality disorder, to see kind of beneath the label of, what might look like underachieving, but what sounds like to me is survival behind it. And I hope people will pick up a copy of the book. I want to thank you again, Blair, and I hope that you will continue to thrive and enjoy your music as you do.
Thank you so much for having me. And I wish everybody a great, happy Halloween. I didn't mean to spook all of you, but I'd rather, you realize I'm not going to mince words. It does a disservice to people who are suffering from this and the potential of becoming a benefactor as a parent. and having a
Beautiful.
dependent child.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. We will speak with all of you again next month. Thank you, Blair, and have a gentle day. Bye-bye.
I thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with your host, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.